So if you have a choice to write a proprietary program or nothing at all, you should to do nothing at all. It's better if you do nothing at all, because that's not doing harm to others. Developing a proprietary program is doing harm to others. So the aim of the free software movement is that all programs should be free so that all the users can be free. We aim for the liberation of cyberspace and all of its inhabitants. We hope that you will escape from proprietary software and join us in the free world that we've built. Now, free software versus proprietary software relates to some of the other issues that I mentioned before. For instance, if a program is not free, it can be set up to do surveillance. It can be set up to restrict the users. Those are examples of malicious features. Features that are not intended to serve the user, but instead to harm the user. And we find those quite often in proprietary programs. We also find backdoors, which are malicious features that allow someone remotely to send commands to do things to the user. So these implement abuse of the user. And these are all rife in proprietary programs. For instance, one proprietary package that has all three that you may have heard of is called Microsoft Windows. There are known established spyware features. There are known established features to restrict what users do with the data in their own computers. These are known as Digital Restrictions Management, DRM, or digital handcuffs. And there are known backdoors, including one universal backdoor, which allows Microsoft to impose software changes. Microsoft can impose any software change into Windows through the Windows Update facility. And that means whatever nasty thing Microsoft might want to do to somebody, it can put in a software change to do that and then use it on him. So this is a universal backdoor. So in other words, Windows is not just malware, it's universal malware. In that any bad thing that someone could imagine, Windows can be made by Microsoft to do to someone. The Macintosh system is also malware. It has digital handcuffs. The newer Apple products, the iGrown and the iBad, have worse digital handcuffs because Apple has seized control over the very installation of applications. Users can't even freely run whatever program they choose to run on these computers. And they have a backdoor. With this backdoor, Apple can forcibly delete installed applications. So these are malware too. Then there's the Adobe Flash Player, which is known to have surveillance features and digital handcuffs. So the Flash Player is malware. And then there is the Amazon Swindle, a so-called ebook reader whose purpose is to swindle readers out of the traditional freedoms of readers of books, such as the freedom to acquire a book anonymously by paying cash. Well, you can't buy books for cash with the swindle, at least not with the books that are regularly in print, because the only place to get them is from Amazon, and Amazon requires users to identify themselves. which means that Amazon collects a database listing all the books that each user has acquired. Now, such a list must not be tolerated because it's a threat to human rights, especially under a regime that can imprison people for the books they have read, like the regime in the UK. Then there's the freedom to give, lend, or sell a book to someone else. For the swindle, Amazon takes this away, first of all, with digital handcuffs designed to stop it from being done, and second, with legal restrictions that effectively say that the swindle user can't really own a book in the usual sense. So Amazon has basically contempt for private property. Then there's the freedom to keep a book for as long as one wishes and read it as many times as one wishes and perhaps pass it on to one's heirs, which Amazon has abolished with a back door. We know about this back door because we observed it being used. In 2009, Amazon remotely deleted thousands of copies of a particular book, namely 1984 by George Orwell. A perfect way to demonstrate the Orwellian nature of this product. There was a lot of bad publicity. Oh, by the way, those were copies that had been authorized. People had got them directly from Amazon, so Amazon knew exactly where they were. And Amazon, after the bad publicity, said they would never do it again unless ordered by the state. How comforting. The official name of this product is Kindle. Kindle means to start a fire. Evidently, this was a product envisaged to burn our books, if we let it, because I'm never going to let it burn mine. E-books are basically acceptable if they do not diminish our freedom compared with ordinary published books. So that means you've got to be able to buy them anonymously, receive them without DRM, and without licenses that restrict you more than a printed book does. And otherwise, you should never, under any circumstances, accept one, unless perhaps it were to, for the purpose of studying how to break the digital handcuffs. That's the only legitimate thing that can be done with them. So, software that's not under the control of the users is very often used explicitly to harm and attack the users. It's therefore not just a theoretical concern that in principle you ought to insist on control of the software you use. It's a real and frequent practice to turn your software against you if it's not free. With free software, we have a defense. Because with free software, users, if they have the skill of programming, they can read the source code. And they don't just do this because they wonder if there might be a malicious feature. They have other motives, like they might want to change the program to make it more convenient. After all, an intentional malicious feature is not the only thing you might dislike in a program. Even if the program was designed with all the goodwill in the world, attempting to make it good to use, nobody's perfect, and people don't want the same thing. So you might not like what the author wrote. You might want it to work differently, and you might decide to change it just to make it better for you. And with free software, you can do that, and then you can publish your version, because surely if you like a certain thing, somebody else will like it too. But in the process of doing this, If there happens to be a malicious feature, you've got a chance to notice it. And then you can fix the program. You can remove the malicious feature. So with free software, the users are not helpless the way they are with proprietary software. The users of free software have a defense against malicious features. It's not perfect. There is no perfect defense, no. But it's a lot better than being totally defenseless, as the users of proprietary software without Freedom 1 generally are. Now, one further thing that I should say on this topic is that schools and all educational activities ethically have the ethical obligation to teach only free software. And that's because they have a social mission, which is to educate good citizens of a strong and capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. And where computing is concerned, that means teaching people to be free software users. For a school to teach proprietary software is like handing out tobacco to get the students hooked on continuing to use it. And I wasn't the first to say this. Mr. Bill said this in the 1990s, that the use of unauthorized copies of Windows would get people hooked, get people addicted, he said, and then eventually they'd find a way to squeeze money out of them. Well, convincing schools to teach people to use proprietary software is getting them hooked. That's why proprietary software companies and the Gates Foundation donate gratis copies of these proprietary non-free programs to schools, because they want the schools to implant the dependence into the students, and once they graduate, of course, they're not going to be offered gratis copies. Oh no. And they go to work for companies. Those companies are not going to be offered gratis copies. So if the school agrees to direct its students down the path of permanent dependence, then they have a chance to drag the rest of society with them down that path. Well, this is a harmful effect. Schools should not do this. They should refuse to teach proprietary software. They should teach only free software. But there are more reasons. First of all, free software offers those students who have a talent for programming the opportunity to learn to be good programmers. How do you learn to be a good programmer? How do you learn to write good, clean code? By reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Only free software offers the opportunity to read lots of code of programs, large programs that we really use. And you have to write lots of code, which either means writing a tremendous number of small programs or writing a lot of code, writing code for large programs. But how do you get started writing code for large programs? You do it by writing small changes in large programs. And only free software offers the chance to do that, to write a small change for an existing large program that people really use, and then let people really use your change and tell you if it doesn't work. I had the nearly unique opportunity to learn programming this way when I worked at MIT at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, because we had a free software operating system and my job was to make it better. But today, any school can offer this opportunity if it's a free software school. But there's an even deeper reason why schools must teach only free software: for moral education, education in citizenship. Every class must have this rule. Students, If you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the rest of the class, including the source code in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. The school must give a good example, and that means following its own rule. The school must bring only free software to class and must share copies, including the source code, with everyone in the class that wants them. There must be no non-free software in the school. Non-free software is the enemy of the spirit of education, and it teaches a nasty lesson. So it must not be tolerated in schools. Oh, and by the way, sometimes the schools can also save money, but that's a secondary practical benefit, less important than the other reasons. So, moving on from the threat of non-free software to the next issue, nowadays, people sometimes do their computing not in their own computers, but rather in somebody else's network server. And this is software as a service, and it means you lose control of your computing, so you mustn't do it. Software as a service means that instead of running a program in your own computer on the data you've got, which potentially means you can have control of your computing if the program's free. Instead, you send the data to somebody else's computer, and your computing is done in that computer by, you don't know what programs. You can't see them. And then the server sends you the result, or maybe it takes action directly for you, and that way you can't possibly control your computing because it's done by programs that you can't see or touch. With proprietary software, people typically get the executable, but they don't get the source code. Well, to figure out what that executable really does is reverse engineering. It's a very big job, so in practice it just isn't feasible. And to change it is even harder. But with software as a service, the user doesn't get the source code or the executable. The executable is in someone else's server, and the user can't see it at all. So it's impossible in principle to find out what that program does or change it. I won't say that this is worse, but you're even further away from having the control that you deserve. But in another way, software as a service is worse. Some proprietary programs have surveillance features that send data about the use of the machine to somebody's server. Specific pieces of code to send out that data. Well, with software as a service, the user has to send the data to a server, and the result is the same. That server gets the user's data, and who knows what it's going to do with that. Maybe it'll even hand it over to the police, which, in the U.S., it's almost impossible to refuse because of the USAP Riot Act, which they call the Patriot Act, USA Patriot Act, but I refuse to call something so un-American patriotic. That law requires almost every business to hand over whatever data it has about an individual without even informing the individual. And even libraries have to do this, and librarians, some of them started various protests and objections about this. So, this is software as a service is effectively spyware, but it's even worse. Some proprietary programs like Windows have a backdoor that allows someone remotely to impose software changes and change how the user's computer is getting the backdoor. so it must never be used. The only way not to be the victim of someone else's power is don't do software as a service. Software as a service is not very common. If we look at the whole range of network services, or network servers, I should say, well, most of them don't provide a non-trivial service. Most of them just make some data available that you can look at. Well, looking at that data is not doing your own computing. It's looking at someone else's data. So that doesn't raise this issue. But if we look at just the non-trivial services, most of them aren't offering to do your computing. Most of them are doing things like communication. So that's a different kind of issue. They're not software as a service. Sites that publish stuff for you, that's not software as a service. Collaborative projects are not software as a service because when you participate in them, you're not doing your own computing. You're helping to do the project's computing. So what's appropriate is that the project have control over its computing. There's no reason why you should have control over it. You're not doing your own computing, which is what you deserve control over. So most of the non-trivial services are also not software as a service. Software as a service is a small minority of network services, but some of them are important. For instance, there's Google Docs. Google Docs invites users to do their word processing in Google's server. Instead of doing it in their own computers with a word processor, the way people have been doing it for decades. And of course, we have free word processors. By using them, you can have control over your computing when you do word processing. But there's no way you can have control over word processing that's done in somebody else's server. Now, it's interesting to look at how software as a service relates to and interacts with the issue of proprietary software. Both of them have the result that the user loses control over her computing, but they produce this result through different pathways. In one case, it's because the user is running a program she can't control, and in the other, it's because she's running a program she can't even see or touch. Now, you might ask, what if the programs running in that server are free? Does that change anything? No, it doesn't. Let's look at both cases. Suppose there's a proprietary program in the server. That means the server operator doesn't control his own computer. He's lost control of his own computer to some software developer. Well, that's unjust towards him and doesn't help the users of the service because it doesn't give them any control. But what if all the software in that server is free software? That means the server operator has full control over what that server is going to do. But that doesn't give the users any control. They're not free to change the software running in this server, and why should they be? After all, the server belongs to somebody. He's the one who deserves to have the control over what goes on in his own computer. And besides, there's no way, if you and I both use this server, we can't both control the software in that server. There's just no way to make software as a service respect users' freedom. So, you just shouldn't use it. This doesn't mean, though, that doing computing on servers is necessarily bad. If it's your server, then you control that server just as much as you might control your laptop. Well, okay. Why shouldn't you divide up your computing between various computers however you like? The issue of software as a service is just whether you control the program that's doing your computing. Another threat to our freedom has to do with putting your data into servers. Now, storing your data in a server opens you up to surveillance, to misuse of your data. Facebook is a good example. Facebook is not software as a service because the basic service it provides is communication and publication. That's not doing your own computing. It's not something you could possibly do inside your own computer. So the issue of software as a service doesn't arise for this. But other issues do. And Facebook is not your friend. Facebook's business is based on doing things with people's personal data. So no matter what pressure people put on, Facebook will never stop doing that. The only way to avoid being mistreated is don't use it. If you look at Stallman.org, you will see a button that says not effed. You won't find me on Facebook. I have never made a Facebook page, and I'm not going to, because I don't want to give Facebook the use of my data. And it's not just a matter that they might leak it somehow to somebody you'd rather not give it to. Even when you publish data, they can use it in ways that hurt you or that are unfair to you. For instance, Facebook sells ads with its users' photos and doesn't give them a choice. Now, those photos they may have published, what's wrong here is not that Facebook is showing the photo to somebody who didn't have a right to see it. It was published. Anybody is welcome to see it. But rather that it's being used to endorse products. Now, I think it's that anybody who endorses a product for money is sort of the lowest of the low. I lose respect for people when they do that. I may say a product is good, but I'm not saying that because of any money. I'm saying it because I think so. And that I would like to let other people know. And I don't do this because of any arrangement with the company that makes that product. I just say what I think. I won't do it as part of a deal with the company. And that's the way I think a person ought to act. Facebook also distributes video using Flash, which is a user-restricting format that shouldn't be used. And it has secondary services that are implemented on the platform, and some of those, I presume, are software as a service, and others are not. It depends on what they do. But what that adds up to is you shouldn't trust Facebook. This doesn't mean, however, that all social networking is bad. It's a matter of details. So what are the things that a site can do to misuse people's data? It can leak that data. If the data is not meant to be published, that's an issue. Can you trust that site? And in the US, if the site's in the US, you basically can't trust it, and you know that. Or it could garble the data, or it could lose the data. Now, I saw a posting where a U.S. lawyer said that AOL had lost his account and lost his data. And at first it said this was an accident, but then it admitted that the Bush regime had asked AOL to lose his data and not be able to find it again. He was defending people that the U.S. didn't want to have defense. And he had relied on AOL to keep this data for him, which, well, you don't have to rely on, if the data, if If it's a copy of data and you've got other copies, well, if it got lost, that wouldn't be a disaster. So there are situations where you can entrust some data to some service, but you've got to think about it. And if the data is in any way private, then no, you shouldn't entrust it to somebody else's server. You might have some legal rights about the data on your own server, but you're not going to have any legal rights about the data on somebody else's server. And a couple of weeks ago, I posted a note on Stallman.org about a campaign calling on Facebook and Google to start defending against subpoenas and requests for users' data and the way Twitter was doing. So apparently they haven't even really tried to protect users' rights. The next threat to our freedom I want to mention is the war on sharing. An attempt to stop us from using computer networks for the things they're best at, which is sharing data, transmitting copies of data. This is tremendously useful. Transmitting copies of published works is a wonderful benefit of the internet. And yet, governments serving various companies and betraying the public are trying to stop us from sharing copies of published works. That is an attack on society, because sharing is good and sharing builds the bonds of society. It's the basis of society. To attack sharing is to attack society. Now, people may think that they will gain by stopping people from sharing, but that doesn't entitle them to do so. Sharing must be legalized, partly because sharing is so useful now that we can do it, and partly because the only way to stop people from sharing is with nasty, draconian, unjust laws. And those companies that have commanded governments to launch a war on sharing have plumbed the depths of violating our ideas of justice. For instance, we see teenagers being sued for hundreds of thousands of dollars for sharing a few songs on the internet. We see mass production threats that were designed to scare people into settling, and they hoped they'd never have to actually sue, and they got into some trouble when they actually did try to sue. So maybe that has been defeated for the moment. But again, these are just ploys, different tactics that are being used, and they keep trying new ones. Whenever one is thwarted, they have another. Another tactic that they've succeeded in imposing in several European countries is punishing people without a trial. Now, that was voted in France, and then the court that considers constitutionality said you can't punish people without a trial, so they redesigned it so that there's a perfunctory trial which can't really consider much in the way of evidence. And then they said, see, now the people are getting a trial. And that was allowed to go into effect. And that's what was done in the Digital Economy Act. And you can see by the way they rushed to pass it that they were working very hard to betray the public, that they were serving somebody else against society. So obviously you should express your undying hostility towards the parties that voted for the Digital Economy Act and don't say they will get rid of it. There was an effort to impose such restrictions around the world in all the advanced countries through the negotiations over ACTA. ACTA is a dishonestly named treaty. Its name stands for, its name officially stands for Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, but Anti-Citizen Tyranny Agreement would be more appropriate, because it's designed to ramp up the war on sharing in the countries that sign. One of the measures that the United States and the European Union already have, which that treaty was going to impose on other countries, and I think may still do so, is prohibiting free software capable of breaking digital handcuffs. That's one thing that they started doing around 10 years ago. There was an EU directive adopted in 2001, for instance, that says that if a among not just free software, but in particular, it always applies if the program is free, if there's a free program that can read or play the work, that's prohibited, because by changing that free program, the users can escape from the digital handcuffs on the work. And these laws prohibit anything that breaks digital handcuffs. So in particular, they prohibit the free software that could be used, even if that free software just plays the work, they still prohibit it, because you could use it to do something else. And right now, Sony is sending the police trying to track down people who figured out how to break the digital handcuffs in the PlayStation 3, and even trying to find people who looked at what they posted. And we're also seeing censorship being proposed for this purpose, as more and more countries adopt laws permitting disconnection of websites through administrative action without a trial. This was recently adopted in France and in Spain, and the U.S. is now proposing it. And this brings me to the next threat: precarity. If you're doing something on the internet, you don't have a right to do it. You do it on sufferance. As long as somebody's willing to cooperate and let you do it. And the internet was famously called the information superhighway. Well, imagine, of course, not all of it's a superhighway, a lot of it is streets. Imagine if you needed permission to walk out onto the street, and that permission could just be denied to you arbitrarily. That's the situation we see in the internet. If you want to write something and hand it to other people, you can do that on your own. You can even buy a printer and then print copies of things and hand them out. Or you could hand out discs, I suppose. But if you want to say something to people over the internet, you've got to get the services of some companies, like an ISP and a domain registrar and maybe a hosting company. And any of them can cut you off, and may do so whenever it's threatened with some kind of annoyance. This was brought home to us by the Dirty Tricks campaign against WikiLeaks. The Obama regime got so angry at WikiLeaks that it decided to do whatever it could to drive WikiLeaks off the net, to prevent it from functioning, all without a trial. So it threatened various hosting companies such as Amazon and pressured them to take down WikiLeaks servers. It attacked domain companies to get WikiLeaks domains abolished. It attacked payment companies. It pressured these companies like PayPal and MasterCard and Visa to refuse to send money to WikiLeaks. And then Bank of America said it wouldn't allow its customers, its depositors, to send money to WikiLeaks in any fashion. This Dirty Tricks campaign shows how vulnerable internet communication and payment is to somebody with this violates freedom of association and other fundamental human rights. There are terrorists, and their acts are crimes, but punishing any kind of crime without a trial is an injustice that's more dangerous than terrorism. Terrorism is just the sort of crime that's easy to make people exaggerate the danger of. For instance, a little under 3,000 people in the U.S. were killed by an act of terrorism in September 2001. And around 4,000 were killed by car accidents in that same month. So which one's more dangerous? Since that time, terrorists have not been able to replicate that attack in the U.S., but cars have done it every month since then, 100 times. Every month, 4,000 or so people killed. So, do we have a global war on car accidents? Maybe that would be more rational than the war on terrorism. But car accidents didn't play into the hands of the people who hate our freedoms. Terrorism did play into their hands. It gave them excuses to launch wars. So, which is more of a threat? The non-state-sponsored terrorists or the state? Well, even if we disregard the Iraqis who Bush killed and whose deaths Bush is responsible for because his crime caused them, the best estimate for them is around 1 million people. Let's put them aside and consider just the Americans that Bush killed. Well, that was 4,500 or more that Bush's invasion of Iraq killed. Well, that's more than the terrorists who attacked in September 2001. We never had a proper investigation of who was responsible for that. Bush weakened the investigation and then corrupted it, so you can't rely on its results. We deserve a new investigation of who was responsible so that we can tell whether people in the Bush regime were partly responsible or who were what. I am a bit skeptical of the claim that they found the passport of an airplane hijacker the very next day. Maybe a passport could have survived such an airplane crash, but that they would find it so fast, I want it to be proved that this really happened. In any case, we see the same thing in the UK. Terrorists killed something like 60 people in London How many people did Blyer kill by sending armies to Iraq? That was hundreds of people. And not only that, if he hadn't done that, he probably wouldn't have inspired the terrorists either. So we mustn't be distracted from the big danger by focusing on the small danger. And that's a general tendency of people. They don't rationally evaluate dangers. I don't remember the figures for deaths from car accidents in the UK. Does anyone know?
2,500.
2,500 per year. Well, that's around 200 a month, right? So, my mental arithmetic is not as good as it used to be. So, well, okay, it's true here too. Why are people focusing their attention on the lesser dangers so much and not just paying money to protect themselves, but surrendering freedom as well? Car accidents don't make it easy to impose security measures that restrict people, but terrorists are a good excuse for that. So we've got to be on guard against the enemies that claim they're protecting us. So those are the threats to our freedom in cyberspace. Some of them we can protect ourselves from. For instance, by rejecting proprietary software, we can protect ourselves from some of these threats. We can protect ourselves from attempts to use our computers against us, to spy on us, to restrict us, to attack us. But that's not a total solution. Surveillance can be done in the ISP. We can't protect ourselves from that by choosing software for our own computers. When surveillance is done by cameras on the street, recognizing license plates, we have to demand laws to make it harder. The police will always say, give us more surveillance power, and it will make it easier for us to catch the thieves that, of course, you want us to catch. Well, sure, but there's diminishing returns in that. And if we make it too easy for the police to know things, we make the state more of a danger. Police in this country are dangerous too. They kill people and they go unpunished. They besiege protesters, endangering their lives, and they go unpunished. As far as I've heard, there has been no legal action taken against a policeman that clubbed a protester and caused that protester to go into the hospital. Meanwhile, somebody else who swung from a flag has been action group on the site. You can find out more about it. And you could participate in that to spread the ideas of free software here. You can look at Stallman.org, my personal site, for urgent action notes recommending things you can do, and for political notes describing threats of surveillance, censorship, dirty tricks against precarity of the use of the net and other related things. And finally, I would now like to auction this adorable GNU that needs a home on behalf of the Free Software, for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. Now, if you purchase the GNU, I will sign either the card or the body. It's easier to see on the card, but I'll do whichever one you prefer. If you have a penguin, then you need to get a GNU, because as we all know, a penguin without a GNU can't really do anything except talk on the phone. And We can accept payment through credit cards or in cash. If you bid, please wave your arm and shout out the amount you're bidding.